Good afternoon, everybody. This is going to be a very exciting plenary panel that will start in about a minute or two. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. One is, please remember at the end of tomorrow, we have a fantastic Pulitzer-led communication workshop that is going to take place tomorrow afternoon. We have scientists who are journalists, who are going to tell us how to engage the media and get our message across. So it's not to be missed. It's free. So please make sure at the end of the conference tomorrow, come out to our Pulitzer-led communication workshop. And also, just as a little reminder, the beautiful photographs that you see that when you're coming in, the two photojournalists who are award-winning photojournalists who did that are actually the two young women who are sitting at the table there. So please go ahead. Those photographs are actually for sale, so if anybody wants to buy them, you can do that. But also go and meet the photojournalists. They're remarkable people. So I'm going to just turn over right now to Dr. Judy WASSERHEIT, our former chair and CUGH board member. Judy.
Well, thank you, Keith. I have the tremendous pleasure and privilege of awarding the CUGH Young Leader Award. And this particular award goes to an individual who must be under 30 and possess three attributes. First, possess a record of outstanding achievement in at least one of three areas, actually 4 areas, education, research, advocacy, and/or service, particularly targeting reduction of health disparities. That's number one. Number two, have established collaborations with colleagues in resource-poor or resource-limited settings. And number three, have demonstrated strong leadership abilities. And this year's award goes to, there we go. Goes to Faith NAWAGI. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about Faith. She has worked with leadership of Afra Health, the College of Ophthalmology for Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, and the Eastern Africa Health Professions Educators Association, convening and bringing institutional members within these organizations together to form partnerships. And through those partnerships, institutional members have provided medical and health professions elective placements for African students. Born and raised in Uganda, Faith currently serves as the African representative for GEMx, which is the Global Education Exchange in Medicine and the Health Professions, a service program of the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates, known to many of us as ECFMG, which is based in Philadelphia, or headquartered in Philadelphia. This particular project aims to build partnerships around the world to enhance exposure of students to a range of health systems. Particularly, Faith, who has been based in Kampala, has been leading these institutional partnerships, particularly across those 3 organizations that I mentioned before, to facilitate African student exchange mobility across the African continent. She has also published several peer-reviewed articles and has already presented her research on community health topics at a number of international conferences. She's also the recipient already of several awards, most recently the 2017 New Voices in Global Health, sponsored by the World Health Summit, which recognized her contributions to African student mobility and as an emerging leader. She actually graduated from Makerere University College of Health Sciences with a bachelor's in nursing and is currently enrolled in a master's program in international public health at Euclid University Global Health Institute as part of her profound commitment to improving health for people of African nations and people around the world. So please join me in congratulating Faith on this award. There she is.
Actually, maybe I'm speechless or something. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored and humbled to be the recipient for this award. And special tribute and thank you goes back to all the mentors back home in Uganda that have made me be who I am today. There are really so many: Dr. Elsie Chiguli, Professor Sarah Chiguli, Professor Nelson Sawankambo, and also to the great team of ECFMG, the Northern partners that have trusted me to run and make impact in Africa with the South-to-South model. Thank you so much.
So now we're going to turn to our afternoon plenary, which is the War on Women. And I'm going to turn this over to Hester Klopper from Stellenbosch, who is one of our board members and who will be moderating this session.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to this panel on the War of Women. So you may think that the theme of the plenary panel discussion comes across as somewhat inflammatory: war on women. However, what we see in practice is that there may be a solid base to depart from this strong statement, and I want to just provide some context for the decision made on a title like this. First and foremost, if we look at leadership in global health, women make up 70% of the global health workforce, yet only occupy around 25% of the leadership positions in global health. If we shift to an issue like sexual violence, some WHO facts indicated that it is estimated that 35% of women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual intimate partner violence or sexual violence by a non-partner of some point in their lives. We've seen from studies that 70% of women have experienced physical and or sexual violence from intimate partners in their lifetime. So therefore, we can then say that the hashtag #MeToo stories in different parts of the world are for real, and they are just written in different ways. Women has become the victims of war around the globe. We've heard much about this in the plenary and the keynote of Stephen Lewis, and I will not repeat some of the comments he made. Lastly, I want to focus on maternal health that has been focusing on lowering maternal or mortality rate. Yet every year we've continued to see that 500,000 of women die as a result of pregnancy or childbirth complications. This includes around 70,000 girls and young women aged between 15 and 19. So most probably the time has come that we make a clear shift, instead of talking about lowering mortality rates to being serious and zero mortality rates. So given this as a very short introduction on some of the aspects that women are faced with, I want to now introduce you to an amazing team and a group of experts, and we are so pleased and honored that you are here and could join us this afternoon. What we will do is, they will each have 10 minutes to make comments first. After that, we will provide about 15 minutes where I will pose questions to them, and we should then have at least another 15 minutes to take some questions from the audience. So our first speaker this afternoon will be Latanya Frett, who is the Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Global, the international arm of Planned Parenthood Federation here in America, with regional and country offices in Africa and Latin America. She has quadrupled the size of the program in the past 4 years since she became involved. Ms. Frett has previously worked 8 years as the Human Rights Officer at the United Nations, UNICEF, the Children's Fund, and for 10 years with the United States Agency on International Development, USAID. She now resides in Nairobi, and the reason for that shift was that she wanted to relocate to the organization's headquarters in Nairobi, and her family has followed her there. So this afternoon, Latanya will speak specifically about what is called the gag. Where did I see that? Sorry, Natanya, I just want to make sure that I do your introduction correct. What she says, and this is very interesting as an introduction to her speech, she says, you know, over time we've now seen in recent years that there has been radical expanded evidence in terms of the harmful gag rule. And this gag rule is about the policy that puts the politics between the patient and the provider. So what she will specifically then speak to this afternoon is to see, since we've seen the impact of these policies on women around the world, she wants to use this as a point of departure. So over to you, Latanya. Thanks.
So she said most of it, so I only have a little to do. Listen, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you today, and we really, from Planned Parenthood side, want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you, and just this esteemed panel. It's very humbling to be here, to be able to talk with them about the war on women. This is lingo that we use a lot over at Planned Parenthood, as most of you know, but I think the conference's purpose today, health disparities, is one that we want to continue to lift up. Beyond sort of just puns, we want to make sure that we shed light on these disparities, that we tackle them and that we come up with sustainable approaches to making sure that we deliver health disparities is something that cuts across the social justice issues, and I think it's very, very important what we're talking about here today, and just privileged to be a part of it. I was thinking about 14 months ago, I was sitting in front of the mirror with my 11-year-old daughter, and we had on our Planned Parenthood global pink, we had on our Planned Parenthood scarves, and she was frustrated with me because our pussy hats were purchased instead of knitted ourselves. And so for those of you that don't know, 14 months ago was probably one of the largest protests in US history. And I assume many people in this room, not just here in New York or Washington, DC, but both around this country and around the world, participated in this moment of solidarity on women's rights. And the voice was important. And I say this, yes, give yourselves a hand. And I talk about my daughter, who's 12 now, not because it was her first march. In fact, she marched for Trayvon, she marched for Eric Gardner, and she, just a year before, was marching for the Chibok girls in northern Nigeria who were kidnapped. And it just made me think about where we are. So this is not a new war on women, in fact, and unfortunately. But fortunately, what we are finding is that our voices are coming together in this war, and that we're seeing ourselves take more collective action, coordinated actions, and that's what's really important. And I think the louder we are, like the students who walked out of their classrooms last week to protest gun violence, I think is where we really have to draw our attention and make sure we stay focused around that. The resistance is what we're calling it. And so while the war on women is global, so is the resistance. The resistance is global as well. I do want to talk, as our colleague said, a little bit about the global gag rule in a tactic, I think, that's being used globally, but particularly from the US administration. And as most of you know, this is a policy that puts, as she said, politics between the provider and the patient. And it uses US government foreign assistance as a methodology, in a sense, to spread an ideology around the world, no matter what the actual receiving and host countries' ideologies are on that particular issue. And it's not a new policy, so this is the fourth iteration, but it has been expanded significantly. It continues to focus on local organizations, which is part of its guts, so that local organizations who provide support and safe environments for women for termination of pregnancy, to refuse them the opportunity to provide those services, to counsel on those services, or to even refer around those services. And for Planned Parenthood Global, it's extremely important. We started about 45 years ago in partnership with USAID and the International Planned Parenthood Federation to provide support and capacity to organizations to lift up the service delivery that they provided and the advocacy and environments that they protected for women in order to mitigate deaths, pregnancy-related deaths, quite frankly. And so we are, I guess, heartened when we see that this has become an issue for all of the social justice movements around the world. But we also know that we can't stop here. When the Mexico City policy came out in 1984, we litigated that policy with the US government, and we lost. And we no longer work with them in this kind of work around the world, although when the gag rule is in place, they don't do the work. When it's not in place, they do fabulous work around sexual and reproductive health, and many of my colleagues can speak to that as well. So in a way, Planned Parenthood Global is kind of built for this moment. We've been here 3 times before, and we know that we have to continue to fight, we have to litigate, we have to march, we have to be there and close to the ground to women, which again is one of the reasons that we moved to our headquarters to Nairobi, Kenya. We know that the resiliency that happens around the world is a resiliency that we have to actually look to, and we have to support and leverage that resiliency for our own country today. So what's going on now with the global gag rule? So actually last month, I think, so February, the administration actually released its 6-month review of the global gag rule. the Global Gag Rule. And it was a skewed and disappointing review of the impact that this policy is having on women around the world. It failed to fully evaluate that impact in a way that made sense. Again, I'm sitting in Kenya, and so I have had the opportunity to talk to organizations, not to mention some of the larger ones like the International Planned Parenthood Federation, or to MSI and Marie Stopes International, who are actually daily having to consider the number of women that they're not able to reach every day because of the decisions that they've had to make around this policy. But I also sat in a meeting with a very local organization just in a small part of Kenya who just recently was turned down as a sub on a USAID project because it offered services and it offered counseling to women in that community. So these are very real impacts that are happening daily, and that even if I can see, I know that many other people can see. And we're working together with Columbia University, with the Mailman School, to make sure that we're actually documenting what's happening, and we're doing a longer study. Because what happens with advocates is that we know each time the Global Gag Rule comes that there's impact, there's problems for women around the world that don't get actually written down and don't get studied. And so whenever we're talking to politicians, it's very anecdotal, the information that we're able to provide them here on the Hill. But now we think that what we can do is look at this over a longer term period and have an actual much more, I'll call it, rich study of what's happening on the ground, so that we're able to take that information and turn it into advocacy where we can see some actual change. Planned Parenthood is also working hard with our members on the Hill to make sure that there is some opportunity to be able to fight back this policy. And so as you saw, probably a couple of days after the Global Gag Rule was signed, the Global HER Act was introduced by Senator Shanine and others who came. Nita Lowy also came forward, and it was supported across the board, across a bipartisan support for the bill, to make sure that we have the opportunity to not introduce policies in countries that are legal here and also legal in their countries. And so it is a way for us to stop this sort of battle, this ping pong. Every time there's a Democrat, it's signed down, and every time there's a Republican, it's signed in. So we'll look to continue doing more work like that. We also saw in the last couple of weeks that the U.S. State Department has been actually censoring women's health and rights from the upcoming human rights report to the UN. And we definitely feel like this is an outrageous step to deprioritize women's health care and undermine human rights. And so we're looking to, with the consortium here and others and other 160 other partners, we've been able to let the administration know that we won't stand for this, that women's health is human rights, and that basic care has to be a part of the work that we do when we do human rights work. So while we can and should talk about the disappointments we've seen in the recent months and the threatened setbacks to women's health that we've made over the last century, I will end where I began, because I think for me the war on women is personal. It's personal for me, it's personal for my colleagues and my family, and particularly my daughter. And I'm glad to be a soldier in this war, but I'm also happier that we're actually getting somewhere. And that, as my boss, Cecile Richards, says, we've had 3 votes to defend Planned Parenthood in Congress, Trump 0 and Planned Parenthood 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for highlighting the impact of the gag rule, and later you will have opportunity to unpack some of the issues that you have highlighted. So our second speaker on the panel this afternoon is Dr. Natalia Callum, who has just recently been appointed, and I think it goes back to October last year, by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and she was appointed as the Executive Director of the United Nations Population Fund. So from CUGH, we also want to say congratulations on this appointment. Very, very pleased that you were appointed. So Dr. Kanem, brings to the position more than 30 years of strategic leadership experience. And this experience has been in medicine, public and reproductive health, social justice, as well as philanthropy. She started a career in the academe and was associated with Johns Hopkins University, as well as Columbia Schools of Medicine and Public Health. From 2014 to 2016, Natalia served as the UNFPA representative in the United Republic of Tanzania. She was also the founding president of Alma Philanthropies, and those of you who might not know about them, they are a private institution and foundation, and to just say, I've been a very thankful recipient of some of that philanthropy back in South Africa. And across Africa, they've supported work in children, youth, and building health systems. So Dr. Kanem is the 5th executive director of UNFPA since the fund became established and operational in 1969. Her focus this afternoon is on discriminatory laws, norms, and gaps in healthcare keeps too many from accessing the sexual and reproductive services, even if the information is available. And to address those inequalities has been really her work for the past 30 years, and she will be sharing some of that with us. Over to you, Dr. Kanem.
Good afternoon. I greet you in peace. Peace is the noblest purpose of the United Nations, and it's also part of the sacred duty of every teacher to be sure to transmit facts and receive knowledge, but also to help those who come after us to be able to participate in dialogue with evidence-based information. So I'm very happy to be here. I also would like to acknowledge some of my mentors and colleagues who have been a tremendous support throughout my career, a lot of which has dealt with international health, and I'm always so happy to see you. I'm also very impressed that this organization, not quite a decade old, has been able to garner this kind of response as you do every year. Latanya has put on the table a fact, and it is that policy matters, and the global gag rule is devastating global health programs that focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights. In particular, the rights of some of the most vulnerable women and girls on the planet. It's also true that the United States determinations have affected the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, which I so proudly represent. And again this year, we've lost funding. As we analyze the loss of almost $70 million last year, half of that would have gone to support our life-saving work in humanitarian emergencies. And it's been a huge blow at a time when there's so much displacement and so much humanitarian crisis. And it is growing in frequency and intensity and in scope. From Syria to Rohingya, we're across the border from Myanmar into Bangladesh. We are seeing some of the worst forms of sexualized violence against women and girls, and some men, in history. And in places like Yemen and Iraq and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the war on women is quite literal. And the risks for women and girls in this type of a situation, disproportionately high. While the services and the support towards well-being and recovery, mental health support, very disproportionately low. And in fact, out of the 800 women who will die due to pregnancy-related complications by the end of today, half of them will be girls and women located in emergency situations. Devastating and deadly consequences. Beyond that, I just have to agree that the posture of Washington has emboldened other UN member states and those who oppose our issues. And we see this pushback firsthand. We've seen it this week during the debate on the Commission on the Status of Women down the road. Nations are becoming increasingly polarized around the body integrity, around the health and the well-being of women and girls, and issues such as sexual and reproductive health and rights, abortion, comprehensive sexuality education that would give life-saving information age-appropriate to children, being debated, being relitigated, being brought back for discussion. The place of parents, culture and religion, sexual orientation, choice, gender identity. We've all been hearing member states question the universality of basic human rights. I quote, "A girl does not have rights over her own body," end quote. I quote, "Parents are the ones who decide over the education of their children based on their religious and cultural beliefs," end quote. But what's very important is that we keep pushing forward. And at UNFPA, we always say that if we weren't strong and if we weren't moving forward, then there would be no opposition. And the strong grassroots movements that Latanya alluded to include also some that are hoping to replace funding we're lost, such as She Decides. The Me Too movement, certainly a signal towards an end to sexual and gender-based violence everywhere that it occurs. And we also see that young people themselves are upholding the principles of decency, of equality, and of the rights of women and girls. So this is newfound energy. I think it's amplifying our voices at the highest level of government, and there are strong governments in support, as much as in the corridors of the United Nations, where our Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, declared this week, very proudly, "I too am a feminist." So I am optimistic that something good is going to come out of this progressive movement that we see all around us. And I remind myself of a proverb that I actually learned in East Africa: "The moon moves slowly, but it covers the town." And I believe that we are going in the right direction, despite the discriminatory laws, despite the gaps in healthcare, in health systems. And this is why the WHO push for universal health care is so important. Millions of women and girls who cannot access sexual and reproductive health services or even information about such services. And there are over 200 million women. Our estimate is 214 million women as part of the collective that's working on this FP 2020, who would want to avoid pregnancy, who want to limit their family size, who want to decide how often to be pregnant, who cannot access modern contraceptive methods that is accessible to them, that is at a price that they can afford, that reaches their island community, their mountain community. And somewhere right now, there's a woman under duress in labor. Is she going to be able to deliver safely? Will there be a midwife who can reach her in order to render care? And when she gets to the health post, is someone going to be home who can perform a safe delivery? Massive toll on women's health and on the futures of adolescent girls, because for them, unintended pregnancy is a calamity that is going to divert their life potential. Very hard to recover from. And we note with alarm certain countries that are now jailing young girls for being pregnant. Their rights, their ability to join or to stay in school, participate in a workforce, participate in the social life of their community, aspire to be the president one day. All of this is countered when a girl's education is interrupted due to pregnancy. So when we are accused of spoiling the innocence of a young girl, we find that it is really important to remind people that young people deserve information. And in a continent like Africa, we're the only cohort in the world where HIV incidence rates are rising, is the African adolescent girl. We have to be clear that this is protective, life-saving information. So the moon may move slowly, but we want to see that pace accelerate as we purposefully go forward. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One is from the Philippines, where there's been groundbreaking legislation to recognize women's sexual and reproductive rights. They call it the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act. And it's a law that would guarantee universal free access to contraception, expanded reproductive health education, and recognize a woman's right in that heavily religious Catholic and Muslim environment to post-abortion care. It was immediately challenged by conservative groups, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court. The only thing was, by striking down just a few selected provisions of the law, the Supreme Court effectively allowed providers to be the ones to decide to deny services based on their personal or religious beliefs. And it also allowed parental consent for adolescent services to stay. So again, slow, deliberate progress, but sometimes one step back. And of course, this is not unique to the Philippines. We work in more than 150 countries around the world, and the discriminatory legislation, the stigma, the secrecy, and the taboo. You know, I want everyone here to be that guest at the dinner table who's willing to talk about sex and female genital mutilation and whatever it is that really describes the reality for millions of people around the world. And I'm delighted that we have strategic and highly active partners. The trend lines are actually going in the right direction for maternal mortality and for things like female genital mutilation, and very importantly, child marriage. But accelerating that success is what a partnership like you, us, united together, represent. And that's why political will and community engagement and targeted investments have been changing practice, persuasion, because it can't always be the like-minded, and this is changing lives. We work jointly as UNFPA and UNICEF in countries on female genital mutilation, and I want you to know that more than 25 million people in some 18,000 communities across 15 countries have already publicly disavowed this practice over the last 10 years. And globally, the prevalence has declined by about a quarter since the year 2000. But countries that continue to practice FGM also tend to have higher birth rates. And so while prevalence drops, we're still fighting an uphill battle. And this is where social norms come into play, and the arbiters of social norms are the communities. So very important to track by government, by community, by family, and medical professionals must come together to oppose the practice. Very disappointing in Kenya that it's a medical professional that has laid a legislative challenge to the law that would abandon FGM. And that's continuing through the courts there. By the year 2030, which is the year of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the SDG generation, more than a third of all births worldwide will be in the 30 countries where FGM is practiced. And we estimate that 68 million girls could be subjected to female genital mutilation by that year 2030 without massively scaling up efforts. We know what works, but as I said, it's a race against the trends. And I think it's very exciting that many girls and boys are raising their voices against this practice. And usually it's the poorest girls who have the least say, the least power to decide. Many of them cannot decide whom they're going to marry. They can't negotiate sexual activity. And if they become pregnant, the power dynamics also mean that they will be among those who are left behind. So we need to make particularly clear this point that young people deserve our respect, they deserve information, and refute this topic, because the coalitions that want to go back to abstinence only are gathering money, they're gathering conviction, and they're gathering political support. It is just and even more important for those of us who represent a view of science. As I said in Seattle in talking to the Society on Adolescent Health and Medicine on Wednesday, miasma has to yield to the science of waterborne or airborne disease. And that's what we're talking about when we're relitigating abstinence only, which has been proven over and over and over and over again not to work. So that is why bringing evidence and data to bear to drive change and inform policy, decision-making, it's a crucial priority for us at UNFPA and for all of us here. Even in a place like Niger, which has the highest fertility rate in the world, it's 7 births per woman on average, and of course, sadly, one of the highest rates of maternal mortality, we're seeing progress, and a lot of this is being led by the traditional chiefs changing attitudes and by a program that they call husbands' schools, which in a community where the wife must ask permission, educates the husband as to the need for skilled attendance at birth and contraceptive prevalence and the availability of contraceptives for those who choose to use. So it's happening, but again, the speed. In July last year, UNFPA convened over 1,000 Muslim leaders, mostly men, from around the world for a symposium in N'Djamena in Chad. And the discussion was about Islam and the demographic dividend. It's been amazing for me to see that the term demographic dividend has currency in Africa. The African Union adopted it as its theme for the decade. And in line with this, our efforts to combat gender-biased sex selection are also bearing fruit. In Armenia, for example, where there's a broad-based coalition to end boy preference and gender-biased sex selection. Many countries are also ending marry your rapist laws, and the European Union and the United Nations joined forces in an initiative called the Spotlight Initiative recently, just in the last few months, to try to help to spotlight gender-based violence around the world. And together with UN Women and UNDP, the rights issue is what underlines this proposal. So to close, I will say that as UNFPA turns 50 next year, and it will also be the 25th anniversary of Cairo, the International Conference of Population and Development. We are hoping to partner with you to make sure that 3 zeros come into fruition based on data, based on evidence, based on reality. The first one is to end the unmet need for family planning for women and couples who wish. The second is for there to be 0 preventable maternal deaths, and thirdly, 0 violence and harmful practices against women and girls, and in this, I do include female genital mutilation and the violence of early and forced marriage. We look forward to partnering with the consortium, training, research opportunities to advance the Sustainable Development Agenda, and in our case, specifically, sexual and reproductive health and rights of women and girls. And we pledge to do what we have to do at UNFPA to keep moving forward. Governments, civil society, religious, community leaders, the private sector, media, men and boys, women and girls. And with our collective commitment and knowledge and strategizing, working together, I am sure that we will end up with a world where the inherent dignity of every woman and girl is upheld, and that a 10-year-old girl walking her path in life will meet a safe, pleasurable, and healthy ability to exercise her reproductive rights. So onward. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kanem, for sharing experiences from your work in changing harmful social norms and promoting women and girls' health and their rights. Our third panelist this afternoon is Dr. Geeta Gupta, who is currently the Executive Director of 3D Programs for Girls and Women and a Senior Fellow of the United Nations Foundation, as well as a visiting scholar at Stanford University. She's also serves as the co-chair of the Gender-Based Violence Task Force of the World Bank, a member of the Independent Oversight and Advisory Committee of the WHO Health Emergency. From 2011 to 2016, Dr. Gupta served as the Deputy Executive Director of UNICEF and has also been a Senior Fellow of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Her focus this afternoon is the war being waged against women has its roots in gender norms that are very rigid, opposing definitions of femininity and masculinity. And what she will specifically focus on then is to say that we have to find ways to raise the value of girls and women in society. Media may be one, but then she will also speak to the grassroots of activism by women. So over to you, Dr. Gupta.
Good afternoon, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here with you this afternoon. Natalia and I were talking just before the panel started, and the phrase that came to her and has been coming to me over and over in the last few months is that this is the best of times and the worst of times. Because we have certainly made enormous progress. If you think about it, this International Women's Day was 100 years after the first International Women's Day. And since then, there are definitely more women working, more girls going to school, more women getting elected, more women enjoying healthy lives, assuming leadership positions, etc. But we still have a very long way to go. In fact, the World Economic Forum's 2017 Global Gender Gap Report estimates that at this pace of progress, it would take another 200 years for us to close the gender gap between women and men. And the State of the World's Population from UNFPA reports that 68 countries had larger gender gaps in 2016 than in 2015. So we know that progress is rarely a straight path forward. Change is often met with resistance. I used to, in the past, describe the march toward gender equality as 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, with the overall trend sort of being positive. But increasingly, I must admit that it feels like 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards. So why is that? What is it that's pushing us back 3 steps? Simply put, that pushback comes from those who view women's progress as threatening. It comes from those who benefit from the status quo, because gender equality is not just about parity in numbers, it's about a shift in the distribution of power. Gender, like other individual qualifiers like age, race, class, sexual identity, and ethnicity, assigns greater power and privilege to some over others, and gendered systems typically advantage men and all things viewed as masculine over women and all things viewed as feminine. That in turn then translates into an unequal access to productive resources for women, such as income, assets, and education, and restricts their access to political power and voice and decision-making at all levels, which then in turn has significant negative impacts on women's health. One of the hurdles, therefore, that we need to overcome if we are to move forward in this misperception that the sharing of political and economic power is a zero-sum game, is that giving power to some it's what's perceived in the zero-sum game is giving power to some means less power to others. While that may be true in the short term, we know from research that in the long term, when women gain access to economic resources and decision-making power, they use that leverage and the increased earnings to invest in the health, nutrition, education, and well-being of their children and their families. And as a result, investing in women and increasing their power pays dividends for all: families, communities, and entire nations. Ultimately, the roots of the war against women and gender equality lie in gender norms that impose opposing and binary definitions of masculinity and femininity. That rigidity and the sanctions associated with those who don't adhere to those rigid norms imposes a cost not just on women, but also on men. And that's the message that we haven't gotten out there as strongly as we should. If the cultural definitions of masculinity continue to emphasize dominance and power over compassion and respect, everyone loses. Women see the costs of subservient femininity in the gross violation of their rights, in the high rates of child marriage in South Asia and Northern Africa that Natalia talked about, in the low sex ratio in India, the fewer women than men in many of the northern states in India that exist today, and in the unacceptably high rates of violence against women globally. For men, the rigid norms of masculinity lead to homophobia, higher rates of homicides and road accidents, higher rates of alcoholism and drug use, and lower life expectancy overall than women. So what can we do to change restrictive gender norms, to increase the value of girls in society, and to allow men to be caring and dependent, if necessary, without censure? First, we need laws and policies, and we've all talked about that, to promote equality. And we've seen a great deal of progress on this front, but we've also seen evidence of an enormous backlash, such as the increasing number of laws that criminalize same-sex relationships, or the laws, as you heard previously, from the allowing women to control their own reproductive destinies with the global gag rule and such. A legal and policy framework to guarantee equality between women and men is definitely the foundation. It's a foundation to build a just society. But to get those laws and policies in place, we need data, we need evidence. That, therefore, is the second piece that needs to be in place. We need data on the realities of women's life. Can you believe that in this, the 21st century, the gaps in data on women's lives are just unbelievable? And we know that if you don't count women, women are not going to count. According to Data 2X, less than a third of countries disaggregate statistics by sex on informal employment, entrepreneurship, violence against women, and unpaid work. We also need evidence on the cost to families of regressive policies. As was mentioned, we need to know what the global gag rule is doing to women and families. And we need evidence on what works to rectify inequalities and change gender norms, so that the policies can then support the scaling up of evidence-based programs. Third, I believe that we need to intervene early. Pre-adolescence and adolescence, or even earlier, are the stages of the life cycle when norms are crystallized through socialization. So intervening then to make it possible for girls to excel in sports, science, or building model airplanes, and for boys to choose sewing and cooking as hobbies is what will begin to dislodge those stubborn and persistent patriarchal norms. Fourth, we need to find incentives to motivate the large forces that shape and reinforce norms. We need to motivate them to do things differently. And I'm referring here to the large marketing and media machinery, the gaming and music industry, and the entertainment industry, all of which have such a large influence on gender norms and can play a pivotal role in changing the damaging beliefs and attitudes that uphold those norms. We have some excellent examples of companies like Unilever's, if you've seen the Dove campaign, and Procter & Gamble, the hashtag Share the Load campaign, that have challenged gender stereotypes. In fact, in 2017, I was very pleased to see that UN Women has entered into a partnership with Unilever and many other industry leaders like Google, Facebook, Mars, Microsoft, etc., to launch something called the Unstereotype Alliance, which is a global alliance to banish stereotypical portrayals of gender in advertising and all brand-led content. I don't know how we can incentivize that. Should we institute a global award for the corporation or ad agency that produces the best ad campaigns that are not gender stereotypical? Or maybe something like a Rotten Tomatoes rating to censure companies that promote damaging gender stereotypes with a green rotten tomato? What are the innovative ways to get the media to change the norms that they promote? But ultimately, what is needed to make all of this happen is a sustained and strong grassroots movement. Successful social change has always depended on people who are the most affected, mobilizing and organizing. That is the momentum that is hard to stop. We are seeing that a lot today in the global sphere, as was referred to earlier, the #MeToo campaign and related movements, the environmental rights movement, and perhaps most visibly now in this country, the organizing by young students in support of the Enough is Enough campaign for sensible gun laws. The global women's movement has certainly done a lot for gender equality, both its national manifestations, local, and as well as the global. And they should be credited with a lot of the progress that we have made over the last 3 decades. But it's important to notice that those grassroots organizations, women's organizations, received a lot of funding before the big UN conferences of the 1990s, the Cairo conference and the Beijing conference, from all of the foundations and from bilateral agencies. Immediately after those conferences, if you look at the data, that funding fell rapidly. And so, if you look at it now, there is a study that showed that the funding in 2014, given by major donor countries, only 0.5% of the billions of dollars allocated to promote gender equality in poorer countries was given to women's rights organizations, as compared to 1.2% in 2011. So the trend is downward, and it continues. And without those resources, it's very difficult for grassroots women's organizations to sustain themselves, mobilize, organize, convene, and advocate for the change that we so desperately need. I just want to make one other point. The global women's movements has had, over time, many different strands. Even within the women's health movement, we've had different factions. Reproductive rights movement, the movement for maternal health. I sat in one conference where the movement for neonatal health was battling the movement for maternal health. So we spend far too much time competing with each other for the limelight and finding ways to bring each other down. Given the war against women today, it is essential that we find common ground, we support each other, and let each movement thrive. As we find ways for the women's movement to link with many other related movements, such as the gay rights movements, the youth movements, Black Lives Matter movements, men against rape movements, we need that. We need the multiplicity of leaders, many of whom are young, and the diversity of perspectives that they represent, because it is that diversity of purpose, of strategy, that will help all of us move forward. It is, after all, the ultimate goal of all of these movements is equality and social justice. So we must draw strength from that common goal, converge our efforts when necessary, support each other, not consolidate. We can have our own individual issues, but come together when we need to fight for fundamental human rights and social justice. After all, it's not just about girls and women, even though they bear the largest brunt of the inequality and disadvantage. It's about all of society and about who we are as a people. So time has come now to work together, to use all our combined resources and the multiplicity of leaders, young and old, to resist, which is what I'm sure you're all involved in. I certainly am. That is the only way to win this war against women and sustain the gains that we've made. So, quoting Star Wars, may the force be with you.
Thanks, Dr. Gupta. I think you've touched upon some real grassroots elements that is so important in terms of moving forward. And I really hope it's not going to take 200 years. Professor Reddy is our last panelist that will participate this afternoon, and currently being the president of the Public Health Foundation of India and formerly headed the Department of Cardiology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. This was after he was the first Bernard Loan visiting professor of cardiovascular health at Harvard School of Public Health. He still holds adjunct professorships at Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University, as well as an honorary professorship of medicine at the University of Sydney. When we spoke about compiling and inviting the panel members, we made the point to say that we really wanted to include a man on this panel because we need the buy-in of men to really achieve gender equality. And that is what Professor Reddy promotes. So over to you, Professor Reddy.
Thank you. So now I come here saddled with the guilt of millennia and some responsibility for the future. Miasma must yield to the science of water and airborne disease. Very well said. As Swedish Nobel laureate in economics Gunnar Myrdal said, health leaps out of science and is nourished by the totality of society. Therefore, even as science advances and carries global health forward, it is the total social construct and the social determinants that ultimately decide how that health is actually accessed and distributed. And that is where we have seen women's health suffer the consequences of social injustice over the millennia. Clearly, even in the last 2 centuries, the so-called centuries post-Enlightenment, we have seen women struggle for access to education, fulfilling occupation, civic rights such as the right to vote, representation in social affairs, participation in governance, inheritance of property, equal pay for equal work. We have it everywhere where the discrimination has been rampant. And it's not surprising, therefore, that these various forms of discrimination have actually impacted upon the health of women and the rights of women to access health in all our dimensions. War on women. The word war itself indicates aggression to some extent. What we have heard so far, whether in terms of domestic abuse, sexual violence, female genital mutilation, are aggressive acts of active aggression. But we also see passive aggression in which several rights are denied in patriarchal societies, whether it is the right to education in schools or universities. How long is it since women have been admitted to law schools and medical schools and allowed into those professions? I mean, if you look at it, it's barely a century. So we find also that there is a complicity of others who may not be actual perpetrators of aggression, but by very act of apathy and not voicing the outrage are also complicit in this. And we find that this inequity is often reflected over the entire life course of women in low and middle income countries. If you look at the life of a poor woman in India and apply the feminine lens throughout the life course, from the endangered female fetus to the emaciated girl child who is deprived of adequate nutrition in preference for the male child, the anemic adolescent girl who in India may not be subjected to female genital mutilation, but elsewhere she is, propelled into early marriage and improvident early motherhood, subjected to sexual abuse or domestic violence, neglected health needs, access to health care is often denied, and often the male preference is given even when it comes to the family accessing health services. And ultimately, even as they grow, in terms of non-communicable diseases, whether it's detection and management of high blood pressure and diabetes, or cervical cancer, or mental illness, all of these, the women actually take a second and a very far behind place. And of course, the industry is actively targeting women as new victims of tobacco, so we find that again as an aberration. So, and if women does want to have care, does she have the financial means in terms of seeking care, particularly when there is no protection in terms of assured universal health coverage? So we do find that there are several areas in which women do suffer. But one of the areas that I would like to raise in this context of this conference's focus on disparities, is intergenerational equity. Take, for example, the undernourished woman who is pregnant and has very little nutrition to offer to her child in the womb. Not only is the child likely to have stillbirth, or if born small, is likely to be facing the hazard of infections and early onset of non-communicable diseases, but if that fetus happens to be a girl fetus, a female fetus, then she will have ova developing in the fetus, and the effect of nutrition, undernutrition, through epigenetic effects will not only affect the life course of that female fetus, but of the life yet to be conceived of those ova. So you are having at least 3 generations affected and perhaps more. So the impact of intergenerational equity is magnified when a woman is the victim of inequity. And that is something that we must recognize. But obviously, we have to really look at how gender justice can be achieved. And of course, we have had excellent calls to action in that area. But I believe that there is a great opportunity for women also to actually become major transformational agents and clearing the decks of social injustice. So not just war on women, war of women, where women, not in a militaristic sense, which is more the masculine flaw, but in a transformational sense, where you're waging a war to break down the barriers to progress, and you're liberating the entire society, not just women, into a new paradigm, which is non-militaristic, planetary protective, and very supportive of social justice in all dimensions. Now, when we talk about climate change, when we talk about agriculture and food systems which are likely to assure nutrition security across generations, who are the more natural custodians of intergenerational equity than women, who care much more about the future of their offspring and of their offspring? So I believe this kind of transformational movement can and should be led by women. And we have seen this happen at various levels. In India, for example, where 1/3 of the positions in the Panchayat Raj, which are the local village elected bodies, have been reserved by a constitutional amendment for women leaders to head those Panchayat bodies, despite the feeling that they were all being steered from behind by their husbands or fathers-in-law, etc., despite all those canards, there is clear-cut evidence that the panchayats which were led by women spent more and spent better on education, health, water, and sanitation, the fundamental bricks of laying a healthy society. And therefore, women can be transformational leaders. Women's self-help groups are propelling movements across India. Community health activists called ASHAs, the accredited social health activists, are leading the movement for National Rural Health Mission across the villages of India. And it is this kind of movement that we must ensure, not that they should only be confined to frontline health workers of relatively lower levels of the health system. We need them across the board as qualified health professionals, as well as scientists advancing science. And therefore, I believe it is absolutely necessary that we advance the role of women as critical change agents. And for this, obviously, men too will have to be fairly able and willing participants in that movement. But women will have to actually ensure that the movement is mandated and led by their concerns, which transcend merely the concerns of their gender, but are much more widely applicable to the societal welfare. And men, and I speak as a token man here, must then become the foot soldiers of that movement, because we cannot think of achieving healthy gender relations in isolation without gender equity and gender respect. And unless we ensure that, all the talk about avoiding sexual abuse or providing limited access to sexual and reproductive health rights will not succeed in achieving the objectives. So what do we need to do? A movement has been called for, a movement which aligns different actors and agencies and social change agents across different dimensions of human welfare, not necessarily health, not necessarily restricted to certain gender aspects, but binding together in a common social commitment for a healthier and happier society, which actually rests on the platform of social justice. So what we now need to do is to adopt an agreed agenda, align all change agents, amplify advocacy, accelerate action, and assert accountability. Thank you.
Okay, so once again, thanks to our panelists for sharing your wisdom and being activists for women's rights. So I've got a list of questions, but I think in the looking at the time, I think it would be appropriate to say I'm going to give an opportunity from the audience for one or two questions, and then if there's none, then I will follow with some of those that I want to ask them. So anyone who wants to, please.
Hello. Okay. Hi, my name is Emily. I work at Global Health Strategies and do work on communications and safe abortion. Thank you so much for your comments. It was really inspiring. I'm wondering, and this might be more for Natalia and Latanya, I'm wondering in kind of the global health sphere, how do we reach the next level where all organizations are putting abortion at the center of reproductive justice and healthcare? Right now, yes, of course, with the gag rule, there's policy around it that may limit service providers, but a lot of organizations kind of have a silence for political reasons or donor reasons, et cetera. How are we going to get to the next step of asserting that abortion is a public health crisis and a right for women around the world? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I can start. Thank you so much for the question. It's absolutely important to understand that, especially in the developing world, we estimate that up to a quarter of pregnancy ends in abortion, and we're talking about unsafe abortion, the back alley type. And the methods can be ingestion or insertion of various, but a lot of the hemorrhage that contributes to maternal mortality may not be labeled abortion, but we would have to presume that in a place where abortion is not legal, and you have to put something on the diagnostic sheet, that the contribution of unsafe abortion to women's mortality and morbidity in pregnancy is high. However, much as I alluded to earlier, that there are certain cultural norms and practices that no matter how passionate you may be as a physician, as a public health service provider, you are not the arbiter of the course that a woman will take in her village, in her town, in her nation. So the politics is important, and I'm glad that you brought that up, not to be set aside but to put at the center. And I want you to know that this is one of the most contentious issues that divides consensus in the halls of the United Nations. And we will be discussing migration next month, and abortion will be one of the issues that comes up. This week, as I mentioned, comprehensive sexuality education was put on the table, and that document hasn't finished the consensus isn't finished yet, it's active. So I think that these flashpoints, which do revolve around women, our right to choose our bodies, have to be debated in a political arena. It's not as simple as a public health solution. I wish that it were. Thank you.
Well, I'll just quickly add, thank you, Natalia, but you know, these issues, we've been here where we tried to take the politics out of it, and WHO tried to, you know, to basically finish the sentence that it is a healthcare issue, it's a public health issue. But it gets back, I think, to what Geeta was saying in her statement, that you have to be able to destigmatize these issues socially. And so it is a political issue, and it is a public health issue, and it's going to be both as we go forward. And we, in this war, I think, on women, have to be prepared soldiers to fight on both sides. So, thanks.
Right, next question.
Hi, thank you. So this is very inspiring. I really appreciate everything you've said. I just wanted to ask, what do you think is your role as women in leadership positions, and what the role is of the resistance against the war on women to incorporate the voices of those of gender nonconforming people and those who identify as transgender or genderqueer?
He says, yes, how do we include them?
If I think I heard the question right, and Natalia's just repeated it for me, extremely important. That intersectionality, the way in which we talked about women's rights in the past, didn't pay as much attention to the definition of gender as non-binary, as a continuum, as something that we need to consider now. It's really good that those issues have come up, and that they are center stage now, and that all of us who have been, I've been in the women in development field for 25 years and didn't consider that to be part of my scope of work till very recently. So I will be frank with you and tell you, it's now because of the leadership of people from those movements, people who have faced the discrimination because of their sexual identity or their gender identity, who have spoken up and organized, that have forced us in the women's movement to say, this is much bigger. There are intersections here with sexual and gender identity that we haven't recognized before, and that there are intersections with class, with race, with ethnicity, that we haven't, with caste in India, that we just haven't paid attention to before. It's been far too elite, far too segregated. It's part of the reason why I was trying to say in my remarks that it's time to join hands. We've been far too separate and fighting each other and thinking of each other as being different, and we're not. We're all fighting the same cause. So that's why I was making the point, and you certainly can count on me, and I hope other women in the women's movement.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was checking the order, and if I'm correct, you were next in line.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to the panel for an informative and inspiring talk. My question is really around the economics and the economic information that we're putting out to policymakers. If ideology, if ethics, morals, if that kind of information is not enough, if scientific data and evidence is not enough, have we been making the economic case for these policies, the cost of inaction or the economic consequences? And please excuse my ignorance in this area. Maybe there are seminal reports or information that's been done, but if not, do you think that would push the needle?
Absolutely, and I think one of the panelists mentioned that this is when we talk about evidence and the data not just being anecdotal anymore, that we can't walk into these halls and expect that change is going to happen based on just knowing the detriment that it's causing to women, to girls, and to their families, that we actually have to provide that evidence and data. And I think you make a very good point, and we had this conversation not too long ago at Melman about how do you actually quantify what's not happening. And there are a few organizations, including Melman, but also Guttmacher and others, who are trying to document the lack of action towards these issues is also a cost to organizations. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Natalia talked about the demographic dividend, which is also looking not just at the utility and the economics that come from being able to push these policies, but what happens when you don't and how you can actually go backwards economically.
Can I just briefly say that the theme of the State of World Population Report for 2017 last year was inequality, and we raised the return on investment argument for sexual and reproductive health. And the Lancet Commission on Adolescence, I think it was at the end of last year, also published on the return on investment, saying that $5 US invested in an adolescent girl across the spectrum would yield $120 for an economy. So ministers of planning and ministers of finance are an apt target, and it'd be interesting to see what types of analyses people here have been doing that bring relevance to bear. Thank you.
Just very quickly want to say that economic data has existed for 35 years. We have repeatedly put out publications making the case that investing in women pays for all, right? With numbers in different sectors, agriculture, health, etc. So all I want to say is it's still very important to do. It's still very important to compile, but it is essentially political. So once you can figure out what the political leverage is to get people to pay attention to the issue, then the economic data becomes valuable. But when there's a political and ideological block, that economic data doesn't shift anybody's views very much at all. I just say that through experience.
And then it's that the question shifts from data to, so what is the impact? Yeah, so it's really a shifting goalpost. That was the next question, and then after that, we'll go to the next, and I think that's going to be most probably the end, then another 2 questions, and we'll be done. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. We're looking forward to next year's CUGH conference. Is going to be on International Women's Day, so March 8th. Did anybody notice that? My name is Lori DePreet Brown, and I'm from UW-Madison, and I direct a new initiative called Women and Wellbeing in Wisconsin and the World. We're trying to look at this holistically, looking at our own state and beyond. And I'm wondering what you feel, what's the special role of higher ed in accelerating change here? Universities are difficult places for female students, non-conforming students, and faculty as well. What should we be doing for ourselves in the world at the universities?
You want to try and get at it? Professor Reddy?
We want to be fair.
Well, as far as the universities are concerned, I think you ought to demonstrate very clearly that you will not accept a second-rung position, but assert that you will get what you deserve for your talent and your commitment. I think that is a very critical element. And subsequently, I think you must also support each other, because quite often women can be isolated in work environment, and even students need protection from some of the faculty, being provided support by the faculty. I think standing together is going to be very important. But I think the most important thing is ultimately to demonstrate through the value of your work that you are making major contributions, and that contribution should not be underrated in any instance.
Thanks. Last question.
Okay,
I
thank you
just
very much.
wanted to
Glad I
quickly
saw
add that it's also the place of the university to bridge that research community divide. So all of the discussion about town gown, which I'm sure goes on in your institutions, it's really important to invite people in. So I think that's another aspect of the gender equation. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Lori Garrett. The Garrett in me says, Happy St. Patty's Day to everybody. Crucial question, how are we going to measure, I've been trying myself, I can't figure it out. How are we going to measure the difference between the Bush era gag rule and the Trump era? Because the Trump era is broader. It targets humanitarian relief, famine relief, everything in terms of any secondary partner on the ground that also offers family planning and abortion services. So the impact could be on famine relief. So how do we measure this? It's way beyond asking about the impact on women's health.
Yeah, and I will say, I know there's been, the methodology is not completely sorted out, but I know WAFA and others who are in this room are thinking very, very heavily around how do we tell this story the right way. The first thing, though, is to get the research organizations on the ground involved, and so I think there's been a lot of work to recruit organizations who want to look at these issues in the countries that we're starting with. And those organizations themselves are coming up with methodologies based on what they understand to be the impact. And so I don't want to sit here and draw out the methodology, but those questions are being asked and those questions now are being answered. And I don't think we're doing a comparative to the Bush years, because you're right, this is a much broader policy impact that I think we're going to see. But it is ensuring that there's a methodology.
Natalia, can we have a broader buy-in on this data search from other UN agencies? So that, for example, if the High Commission on Refugees knows that on-the-ground players dealing with refugees are being denied secondary funding because they also provide family planning and abortion services and things like that. I mean, I feel like the apparatus we have in place for acquiring data relevant to women's health is inadequate to this task. And we're going to need much broader partnership across the UN system.
Well, Lori, I have to tell you, we haven't done that yet, and the moment is now. We've more been looking along the lines that Latanya mentioned, and I think it's a brilliant point, and let's talk about it immediately after this session. I'm certainly sure that the consolidated nature of delivery, especially of rural health services, which Geeta just pointed out, means that it's going to be a much bigger swath. So I really appreciate the point, and we can move on that very quickly.
So I really wanted to close, but I've been seeing a hand, so I'm going to give you the last opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful hour and a half discussion. And I really liked, my name is Bob Suskind, and I really liked the title, War on Women. And I think one of the things that you should take from this session is you have a tremendous amount of power. And I think if you look at what's happening in the United States today, the groups that are really making an impact are the ones that go out on the streets. And it's the students from, where is it, in Florida, okay? The students in Florida have gone out en masse against gun violence and have been making a difference. And I think if you take the war on women to the streets of the United States and the world, I think you'll have an impact, because facts don't make a difference, but the power of women in terms of being able to make a difference. You're more than 50% of the population, and you really should get out on the streets, because that's the only way this administration responds, is if there is a loud voice coming in terms of their consolidation of power. So that's what, thank you very much for letting me say that one thing.
Thank you. Hashtag War on Women. So I want to thank the panelists. Listening to all of you and some of the main themes that came through in this panel discussion was evident that we need to move in a space of global synchrony in terms of some of the policies and the uptake of that, working together, moving from having available data, but what is the impact? And what is very evident listening to the panel was that it really takes grit and determination to move from just advocacy to action. And I want to thank you for being part of this panel, and let's move forward. In Africa, we say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Let's go together. Thank you.